Most people assume that when something major changes with their aging parents, the whole family will figure things out together. And sometimes that happens, but more often than people expect, responsibility quietly starts concentrating around one person. And usually that doesn't become obvious until the moment decisions suddenly need to be made. So in this video, I want to walk through how families actually end up making decisions when parents start aging. Because once you understand this part, everything else in this process becomes much easier to navigate. In the last video, we talked about the 5 things that shape almost every decision families end up making when parents start getting older. And the first one was family structure, because family structure usually determines who steps in first, who helps later, and a lot of times, who carries most of the responsibility moving forward. If you're new here, hi, I'm Chris Rainwaters, your favorite real estate witch and a licensed realtor here in Southern California. And a big part of my job isn't helping people buy or sell homes. It's helping families navigate the major transitions around those homes. And aging parents is one of the biggest, which is why this is an 8-part series. This is video 2, so if you're just tuning in here, I really recommend going back and starting at the beginning. That one gives you the big picture overview of what we're covering in this series and how all of these pieces fit together. So everything we talk about here makes a lot more sense in context. All right, let's get into it. Most families don't actually sit down ahead of time and decide who's going to handle what when parents start needing more support. And unfortunately, there's no standard system or one-size-fits-all plan because everyone's situation is different. But there are some distinctive patterns that I've noticed and that research has backed up. So what usually ends up happening is that responsibility starts forming quietly based on whatever the family structure already looks like. Adult children typically provide the majority of care for aging parents in the United States, and in many families, that responsibility ends up concentrating around one primary person rather than being evenly shared. So if you already feel like you're the one this is landing on, you're probably not imagining it. It's actually really common. One of the biggest factors in how this usually plays out is simply geography. So who lives closest? Seriously, because in about 1/3 of families, the adult child who lives closest becomes the primary caregiver, whether that was the original plan or not. Not always because they volunteered or were assigned the job. They're just the one who can get there first if they need to. And once you're the person who shows up first, it's really easy for everyone else to start assuming that that's your role now. So has this already happened, or do you just know it's coming? Either way, drop it in the comments. Like, you don't have to have it figured out. And sometimes it just feels good to get it out, say it out loud to people who actually get it. Another thing families don't always realize until later is that caregiving roles tend to follow patterns that already existed long before anyone got older. The sibling who's always handled the paperwork usually ends up organizing documents. The sibling who's always been the steady one often becomes the decision maker. The sibling who lives nearby becomes the one checking in more often. Families don't usually plan this consciously, it just happens. There's also a pattern that shows up consistently in caregiving research that I think surprises people sometimes. Daughters tend to provide significantly more hands-on care for aging parents than sons do, often nearly twice as many hours on average. That doesn't mean sons don't help, okay? It just means that families often fall into roles that they didn't realize were already there. Okay, I'm gonna be honest here. When I first read this research, I had a lot of feelings about it. And if you're the daughter in this situation, I see you. And if you're the son, genuinely no judgment. But I do want to ask, is this true in your family? What does the split actually look like? Tell me in the comments, because this is one where the real conversation matters more than the statistic. And recognizing that early can prevent a lot of confusion later. Family structure can also change the decision-making process in ways people don't always expect. For example, if parents divorced years ago or remarried, or there are step-siblings involved or different households with different expectations, sometimes responsibility isn't just emotional. Sometimes it's legal, and sometimes families don't discover that difference until they're already in the middle of a difficult situation, which is why it helps so much to look at this piece early. But if you're an only child, this part is going to feel very differently because there usually isn't uncertainty about who's responsible. There's obvious clarity, but there's also pressure. And most only children I work with already know this conversation is eventually going to involve them in a bigger way. And lastly, another common theme that I've noticed is that responsibility inside families is rarely evenly distributed. And that's pretty normal, as we can see. It doesn't automatically mean someone isn't helping. You know, sometimes one person handles appointments and someone else helps financially or emotionally. Sometimes someone lives across the country. What matters most is understanding what's actually happening instead of assuming that everyone sees the situation in the same way. Because most conflict around aging parents doesn't come from disagreement. It comes from surprise. Okay, so here's the question that nobody asks at Thanksgiving, but everyone's thinking. If something happened with mom and dad, like right now tonight, who would make the call? And is that person okay with that? And if you're watching this as the parent, I want to hear from you too. What do you wish your kids would just ask? Once families understand how responsibility is already forming, it becomes much easier having the conversations that prevent confusion later, like who is the emergency contact? Who has access to important documents? Who can speak with doctors if needed? And who helps make the housing decisions if something changes? These aren't dramatic questions right now, unless you want them to be, but answering them early makes everything else easier. Once you understand who's involved and how responsibility is already taking shape inside your family, the next question people usually start asking is the one that feels the most urgent anyway. Are my parents still safe living where they are right now? And that's what we're going to walk through in the next video in this series. If you're in Southern California and want help thinking through all of this, the link to schedule a consult with me is in the description. The next video is linked right here. I'll see you in the next one, but hopefully sooner.